Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the George Washington University. My name is Chuck Cushman. I'm the acting director of the Graduate School of Political Management. We are very pleased to have our guests here this evening to do the second installment of midterm examination and give their thoughts about what's happening in the next couple of weeks. It is exactly this kind of event and this kind of conversation that we like to host here at the GSPM, which I don't know if everyone knows, is the nation's premier school of practical politics, the first school founded 23 years ago to teach people how the business of politics operates and to create leaders for that field. We're very proud to be able to host this kind of event here. We are able to host this event because of the generosity of friends of the Graduate School of Political Management. This evening is sponsored by two wonderful mentors to the school, Ambassador Charles Manat and Mr. Frank Fahrenkopf. Both of them headed their respective political parties in the 80s, have been tremendous political leaders in their own right and philanthropists supporting good political education for the last 3 decades. And I am very pleased to introduce Ambassador Chuck Manat, who will now get the party started with some comments. Ambassador Manat. Thank you,
Thank you, Director, and thank our special panel for being here tonight. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Perhaps 2 weeks from now you might see a grown man cry, and that would be me. So I'm glad we're here before the election rather than after necessarily. My joy really with the students tonight is what I'd like to focus on. I'm sure we have many good students here with us, and I really only had one campaign while a student at George Washington University, where I was sort of in my second year of law school, and it's a Kennedy campaign, Kennedy and Nixon. And we debated primarily with a wonderful man who's in heaven now, future congressman, and he had Vice President Nixon, I had Jack Kennedy, and we debated at small Catholic girls' schools. It was one of the best experiences, frankly, I've ever had in my life. I also got to chauffeur Mrs. Drew Pearson and Mrs. Lindy Boggs, who's still with us, around in Pennsylvania and different places. It was the first time I ever met a Bloody Mary. So I have many, many fond memories of the good campaigning of 1960, which was very hard fought and very close. Our graduate school, the director has highlighted, there's frankly nothing like it. Its position is correct. Its location is right. The focus on really ethics, on decency, and on trying to do a good job in supporting one's family, as Frank and I both have tried to do, and recognize them as supporting this lecture series also. It's just about the right kind of thing that if you're interested in the field, I would suggest every consideration you give to the Graduate School of Political Management. I've already identified my friend Frank Fahrenkopf, who started fighting in Young Republicans when I was fighting in Young Democrats. Many years later, we finally met and have had a positive, a strong personal friendship ever since then. I only wish other politicians could do that. Frank Fahrenkopf.
Thank you, Chuck. One of the reasons that Chuck and I, through our original involvement at GSPM here, decided to endow this lecture series is because of our concern of something I think that may be on the front burner in this election campaign more than I've ever seen it, and that is the inability of members of the Republican and Democratic Party to disagree agreeably. I've been through a lot of campaigns, and watching what I'm seeing on television and observing what I'm hearing, this is a pretty nasty, nasty campaign. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Chuck and I met when he was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. I was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. We fought like cats and dogs. I think I won 49 states that when you hadn't mentioned that 1984 race, but I thought I'd throw that in. But despite that, we worked together as chairman to help create the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute of International Affairs, IRI, the International Republican Institute, worked together on things that we felt were the best interest of our nation and of the young people of this country. I then served for 4 years with a man named Paul Kirk, who became the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Some of you may recall just recently he filled in Senator Kennedy's seat after Teddy's death until the election in Massachusetts with the election of Senator Brown. But again, while Paul and I fought tooth and nail in 1985, we created the Commission on Presidential Debates, which has sponsored every general election debate in presidential politics since 1988. We're friends. As Chuck and I are friends, our wives get along. We go out to dinner. We play golf. In other words, we can be friends even though we disagree on the political direction that each of us would take. And we think that more and more the whole question of comedy in politics ought to be addressed. And you're going to see a little bit of that tonight, because the two people who will be introduced in a moment and who are the stars of this program are from different political parties. And it's my final task to introduce our moderator for this evening's presentation. Mark Murray is NBC's News Deputy Political Director. He joined the network in 2003 and has reported and written about political races, trends, and issues. He's the co-author of NBC's daily political newsletter and blog, First Read, and is a frequent on-air contributor to MSNBC. In fact, I saw you this morning talking about the next governor of Nevada, who's a Hispanic and who may be breaking some real posts from the standpoint of Hispanics being represented in the governor's mansion. Before coming to NBC, he spent more than 5 years as a reporter with the National Journal. He's been a freelance writer for Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Monthly, and Washingtonian Magazine. What also makes one of our guests very, very happy, he's a native Texan, Karen, and a 1996 graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Murray, NBC News Deputy Political Director. Mark, the show's yours.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you very much. And now to introduce the two stars for this panel. First, we'll start with Mark Penn. Mark is the CEO of Burson Marsteller and CEO of Penn, Schoen and Berlin, a strategic research firm. He currently serves as a strategic consultant to many Forbes Fortune 500 companies and CEOs, and is an advisor to corporate leaders like Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Bill Ford. In 2008, he was the chief strategist for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. He's also served as a senior advisor to former President Bill Clinton and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. He is the co-author of Micro Trends, the small forces behind tomorrow's big changes, and he writes our weekly Micro Trends column for the Wall Street Journal. And now on to Karen Hughes. Karen Hughes is the global vice chairman of Burson Marsteller. She served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy from 2005 to 2007. She also served as counselor to President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2002, advising the president on policy and communications. Karen returned to her native Texas in 2002, but continued serving as an informal advisor to the president. She also served as a consultant to the 2004 Bush-Cheney re-election campaign. From 1995 to 2000, Karen served as the director of communications for then Governor Bush in Texas. And she's the past executive director of the Republican Party of Texas and a former TV news reporter for the NBC affiliate in Dallas-Fort Worth. And finally, she's the author of 10 Minutes from Normal, a memoir of her experiences working with President Bush. Both Mark and Karen have opening remarks to make, but I'll turn to the floor and we'll begin with Mark.
Sure. I think that as we look at the likely result of the midterms, and I think Karen is going to go through in a little bit more detail, I think, the current Republican projections, and every day the Republicans come out another 10, 50, 60, 70. I don't know exactly where it's going to come out. We think that expectations, though, have run away a little bit from the polling, which shows most of the races really very close within the margin of error, and where turnout and the final 5 days here are going to make, I think, a tremendous difference in the outcome of this race. I think what I want to hit upon are a couple of important overriding trends about this election, because I think it's important that even if the Republicans win a significant victory, that I don't think it should be interpreted as a victory for the Republican philosophy any more than I think 2008 should be interpreted as a victory for the progressive left. The truth of the matter is that it's the increasingly independent voters who are going to be making the decision here, And increasingly, they're looking, I think, for a centrist brand of politics. And when they're dissatisfied that they don't have centrist leadership, they tend to ping-pong, back and forth. I think if I look at a couple of key trends here, first, independents are at a record historical high since we've been measuring them. So if you go back to the 1930s, it really was a red or blue country. About 85% belonged to one of the two major parties. Today, depending upon the poll, et cetera, it's close to a third to 40% who are independent. The biggest party in America is, in fact, no party, and particularly among younger voters, those numbers are off the charts in terms of younger voters being more independent than ever before. I think you're seeing somewhat of a balkanization of the parties. Remember, first, I think you're seeing the impact here that even though so many more voters are independents, if, say, the Republican Party is 26%, well, as a practical matter, it only takes 14% of the country to have a majority of the Republican Party. And since typically there's only a Democrat and Republican on the ballot, that 14% then can run the entire country. And I think that's precisely where the electorate is getting more and more frustrated. And that's why you're seeing that politics is probably one of the few things left in your life where there are only two flavors. That and I think wine are probably the only two. I think there are 155 different varieties of coffee, and if there's one thing that the voters are demanding, it's more and more choice. There's obviously a huge wave of discontent. I think it's the longest sustained period of discontent that I've seen in my polling lifetime, which goes back now about 35 years. We've seen 2 or 3 year periods, but we've really seen now about a 6-year period of discontent. This could well be, unless the economy picks up, a decade of discontent, and that will have, I think, long-term effects on both the American psyche and on politics today. There's a continued demand for change. They continue to be dissatisfied with what government is doing. And finally, I think there's more partisanship than ever. I find that people are digging more and more into personal backgrounds. The politics of personal destruction is out there stronger than ever. What the ads are saying now, they're going back, I think they're certainly going back to college. They'll probably get to high school, long before. But there's nothing really that seems to be out of bounds for wholesale distribution, over the internet. And I think that is certainly deteriorating some of the discussion of issues. Now, let me just say that people often ask, well, what is it that people want? Okay, and I took a poll for the Aspen Institute earlier this year, and we went in with the theory that people wanted more decisive government, that in fact they were probably impatient with checks and balances and wanted the president to have more power. Well, that was completely wrong. People in this poll reaffirmed checks and balances, said they didn't want the president to have more power, right, and said fundamentally that they wanted, if anything, I think, to have a greater role themselves. Because let me tell you the things that they did back. They backed election of Supreme Court justices. They backed direct election of the president without the Electoral College. And they backed national referenda. What they said was, don't give more power to the politicians, give more power to the people. And so with the new growth of new movements that you're seeing here, whether or not the Tea Party is the ultimate movement or just the second generation of what could become a series of movements, what you're really seeing is people saying that people want more power. When the Constitution was written, typically it relied on a few elites who went to college. Today, college is a majority expectation. Today, voters are smarter, have more access to information, are more issue-oriented, and actually absorb far more about what's going on than ever before. The voters, I read a book in college that was a lot of my underlying thesis of voting behavior, and it said the simple thesis of this book is the voters are not fools. The voters are more than not fools today. They're increasingly astute, and they think that they should have a bigger share of the power because they're not concerned so much about the system as they are about the politicians and their role in the system. And I think that underscores what they're looking for. At the end of the day, they're looking for both parties to sit down, solve the economy, solve immigration, solve health care, and do it in a strong bipartisan fashion. And the voters, as we often find, eventually get their way. And that's the message I think they're sending in this midterms.
Karen?
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I want to thank Chuck and Frank for endowing this series and for encouraging greater civility in our political discussion. Mark and I have been doing some events like this around the country, and I think we both have very different perspectives. He's obviously a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but we found that we can disagree agreeably. And of course, we work together every day, and he's my boss, so I have to be especially nice. This panel is about, by the way, I think that adds value to our clients, the fact that we are able to come at a problem from different perspectives. This panel is about understanding the implications of the midterm elections, and they are really great. The one that you hear the most about is the potential to change the balance of power here in Washington, which of course will affect what legislation is and is not able to be passed over the next couple of years. But it will also set the tone for the final 2 years of the Obama administration. It will be the starting gun for the 2012 presidential race and my party's efforts to find the best Republican to run against President Obama. And it has the potential to shape the political landscape for really the next decade, as we'll be electing governors in 37 states, including 15 of the 18 that will be redistricting next year. And so that will determine legislative and congressional boundaries for the next 10 years. And I think most estimates are that if redistricting is done in a fair way, Republicans have the opportunity to pick up 20 to 25 seats in Congress. And again, that will affect elections for the next 10 years. As Mark mentioned, this is a time of great disillusionment, of deep anxiety. Voters are frustrated, they're angry. The Pew poll cited epic discontent. And for the first time that I can remember, I'm a baby boomer, I'm 53, and for the first time I can remember in my lifetime, I truly believe that my generation of Americans are worried that the country we leave to our children will not be as stable or peaceful or prosperous as the one that we've enjoyed the opportunity to live in. And people are worried that Washington, particularly our federal government, is on a path that is simply not sustainable. And they feel an urgency about that to change things before we walk off a cliff and it's too late. I think there's also a feeling, certainly among Republicans and independents, but even some Democrats, that rather than making things better, President Obama's policies have actually made them worse. He was elected on an idea of hope and change, that our politics could be higher and better. He was not elected to enact trillions of dollars in spending and massively pile up the national debt. And what we've learned is there's a big difference between delivering good speeches, which he's very good at, and delivering good government, because after 2 years, I think, frankly, a lot of people's hopes are dashed. And that's true not only for Republicans and independents, but the woman who stood at the town hall and said, I'm exhausted of trying to defend you and the change that I hope for that hasn't happened. So instead of seeing the best of that our politics could be higher and better, which is what I think people wanted, they've seen the worst of Washington, frankly, in sort of the health care debate with the legislation passed in the middle of the night and people hadn't read it, and you know, these deals, backroom deals, trying to buy votes for the legislation, the stimulus that was just sort of a big pork barrel exercise that didn't really stimulate jobs but only stimulated the debt. And so I think people feel like they've seen the worst of Washington. I think that all adds up to a climate that is going to produce gains for Republicans. I believe that we will win back the House. The Senate is tougher. We need 10 seats, a 10-seat pickup to take the Senate. Right now it probably looks like the polls would lead you to believe maybe 8. I will say, though, however, that every time since World War II, the 6 times since World War II, that the House has changed hands, the Senate also changed hands, even though it had not been predicted before the election. So with that, I think it's going to be a good night for Republicans. There are a lot of races that are still close. Mark's been doing some polling. So, you know, we'll see. We'll be 2 weeks away from, and we'll be back here, I guess, a couple days after the election to talk about who was right and who was wrong. So with that, Mark.
Now we're going to get to the part where we're going to have a little Q&A here before we get to your questions. But I want to start off. We have a brand new NBC Wall Street Journal poll out today that actually shows that Republicans probably might meet your prediction that they're going to have some significant gains. But a lot of polls also show that the Republican Party is sometimes viewed still more unfavorably than the Democratic Party. And with people so down on Washington, if you were to advise perhaps the next speaker, John Boehner, and the Republicans taking over the House, maybe in the Senate, what would you advise them to try to change the mood? As Mark was talking about, right now people are so discontent. How should Republicans approach power if they're able to get it?
Well, I think we need to show that we're listening to the voters and we're listening to what people want. And so I would recommend that we start enacting some things, that if Republicans are indeed in the House, that we need to be positive. We need to show, I would do a bill a day to cut spending. And I would send it on, and let's try to work with the Democrats and find some ways where they agree we can cut spending. We need to extend the tax cuts. Right now, I've been traveling around the country, and every businessman that I talk to just cannot believe that Congress went home without businesses knowing what their taxes are going to be next year. How can they hire people? How can they make investments? And so I think almost all economists agree you don't want to raise taxes when we still have the prospect of sending our economy back into a nosedive. And so, right now we're scheduled to have a $6 trillion tax increase on January 1st if nothing is done. So I would suggest that even before the new Congress is seated, that the lame duck Congress, Republicans need to work with Democrats to extend those tax cuts and make sure that we don't face a massive tax increase on January 1st. I also think I would start as a Republican beginning to look at some of the worst aspects of the health care bill and trying to work with Democrats to fix it and to make it, to begin to replace the onerous parts of it with some much more market-friendly legislation.
And do you think that will happen, the more cooperation with Republicans being able to work on deficit reduction, on tax cuts, maybe sometimes being able to have a compromise where not both sides actually get their way?
Well, it takes two, obviously. I think that if I were advising the Republican leaders, and I think I'm hearing some of that, Kevin McCarthy was quoted in the paper today saying that he wanted to be constructive, and we have a lot of potentially new members of Congress who have experience working in state legislators. In state legislatures, my experience in Texas is that in state legislatures, Republicans and Democrats are pretty accustomed to working together. They work pretty effectively together in a lot of legislatures across the country. And so I would certainly recommend that Republicans approach this in the spirit of let's find some areas of compromise. Let's find some places we can work together. But President Obama is going to have to make a calculation. Is he willing to work with Republicans? And is he willing to compromise and to recognize and listen to the people? He's done a lot of talking, but I think he needs to show that he's listening to the message of the voters.
Mark, you've seen this movie before. 1994, Bill Clinton and Democrats lost control of the House and the Senate. It could happen again. You helped advise President Clinton in 1996 to help him start getting reelected up until right after they lost control of the House and the Senate. What would you advise President Obama and his advisors to do if Republicans take back control?
Well, I think if Republicans take back control, I think there's going to be a moment of truth for both parties. Maybe the Republicans are going to want to cooperate and make a political calculation that it's better. Maybe they're going to want to sit there and say no. I think either way, the president's job in those circumstances would be to neutralize some of the growing negatives that he's experienced. And I think specifically, probably, and I've recommended that he could extend the tax cuts a year, but use that year to really come up with a good tax reform bill. People think that the system's unfair, it's unworkable, it's still got too many loopholes, it still benefits people that shouldn't be benefiting. So maybe extend them for the economy, but then really come back a year later with a tax reform bill and put it to the Republicans. Isn't it time we had a simpler, fairer system? I think on health care, I think he's got to continue to monitor health care. I think that health care expanded coverage, but it didn't do enough to control costs. I think he's going to come back and face the cost issue on health care before it gets out of control and blows back on him. I think he could do a lot more in terms of some of the values issues. If you remember, President Clinton did a lot of issues, whether it was deadbeat dads, or in tracking them down, or whether it was taking a tougher approach to, violence and drugs in our schools. I think so far the administration hasn't been strong enough in showing that it understands the everyday concerns of people out there and is reaching out and touching them. And on the deficit, I don't think the administration's got to stop the basic policy of trying to prime the pump and create jobs. But they do have to draw some line in the sand on the deficit to say, here's the limit, we're not going to go past that, and really hold the limit so that people know that there is one. And finally, and probably most importantly, the administration has to adopt a more comprehensive economic strategy. If you go back to '94, President Clinton had a lot of things in there: expanding trade, investment in education, innovation, closing the deficit. Some of them really were favored by Democrats, others were favored by Republicans, but they hung together as a consistent and coherent economic strategy for growth. You know, with places like China and India really leapfrogging in economic growth, it's important that the United States remain competitive and that the president get out there ahead of the wave of global innovation and not leave America behind it. I think if he neutralizes those weaknesses, the truth of the matter is this election, no matter how it comes out, will not be an endorsement of the Republican philosophy. It will be an expression of discontent that the problems aren't solved yet. And if the president neutralizes those negatives, moves his administration into the center, he can repeat pretty much what President Clinton did, I believe, which is to come back from this within a 2-year period and win a landslide re-election. I think it's certainly possible.
Oftentimes, the conventional wisdom in Washington and on TV, cable TV, can be wrong. We saw that where everyone thought in Delaware that Mike Castle was going to beat Christine O'Donnell. Christine O'Donnell won. We thought that Lisa Murkowski would easily end up beating Joe Miller. Joe Miller won. Is there a path for Democrats to be able to beat a lot of the conventional wisdom that people say they're going to lose the House, the Senate is maybe up for grabs? Is there a path for Democrats?
You know, look, I think the scenario here in the last 14 days is pretty much, most of these races are really within 2 or 3 points. They're mostly in the low 40s, right? There's still a good 10 to 15% undecided in every district. The question you've really got is discontent against those who are in. You've got a balance against, I think, you know, both growing fear that you're going to bring back the policies of the Bush administration that remain as unpopular as ever, and also put in power a basically unstable party that's lost control of itself, that's headlined by candidates that are a turnoff. Look, I saw Sarah Palin headlining, you know, the Today Show out there stumping. Well, that's the best reason that it might turn for Democrats, because even though she's a powerful turnout machine for the base, she's a turnoff, particularly to younger people, to young professionals, to better educated, to exactly those voters that Obama won in 2008 and that have been peeling off. The more they see of Sarah Palin and the Tea Party, the more the last couple of days could break the Democratic way.
Well,
that's the
I think
best way
Mark's
to turn
engaging
this
in
around.
some wishful thinking. I think that listening to his litany of what President Obama ought to do differently, I think shows how far out of the mainstream President Obama's policies are. That the idea of controlling costs in health care, I mean, that's pretty fundamental. The health care reform was sold as a way of reforming costs, and obviously it does nothing to control costs. And so I really think that the Tea Party has energized our party, has reminded the Republican Party of what it stands for. We are the party of limited government and lower taxes, and frankly, I think we need to examine ourselves and look at the last time we controlled the House and the Senate. We probably spent too much money. We certainly spent too much money. And so I think the Tea Party has brought enthusiasm and new people into our party. I remember being the executive director of the Republican Party of Texas in 1992 when another Tea Party type movement, that backing Ross Perot, ended up costing us the presidential election. So I, for one, am very grateful that Tea Party activists chose to follow their principles and remain in the Republican Party and become an energizing force, reminding our party of what we really stand for, which is limited government and a strong national defense and less spending and more power to the states and local governments and less power to Washington. And so I think it's been an energizing force for our party. Clearly the momentum's on our side. We can't be complacent. These final 2 weeks of the election, we have a great opportunity here, and we have to really work hard to turn out the independents and the conservative Democrats who agree with us and to bring this home, because I think it's really important for our country.
Karen, are there some potential drawbacks, though, with the Tea Party that sometimes some of the candidates out there might be too conservative to win in the state, like Delaware, for example, with Christine O'Donnell, and certainly following the George W. Bush's gubernatorial bid as well as his presidential, that there was an effort to win over swing voters and independents, and the Tea Party seems to be just a play in a way to the Republican base, and particularly that's what Sarah Palin's doing. So are there some potential drawbacks?
Well, obviously, anytime you have candidates on one side to the far right, to the far left, that happens in the American political process. But my answer to those who want to complain about who won our primaries is find a better candidate and win the primary next time. I mean, as a former executive director of the Republican Party, and I know Frank as a former chairman, when we When candidates run in our primaries and they're elected by our primary voters, then I think we have an obligation to support them and to try to elect them. And then if we want someone different, we have a chance in the next primary to choose someone different.
So I have to say that I'm fascinated by Karen's kind of hugging of the Tea Party and how this period of indecision with Republicans, they figure there's 2 weeks to the election. You might as well join them because based on the primaries, you clearly can't defeat them.
Well, but I don't agree with that. I mean, I know people in the Tea Party. They're my friends. They've been Republicans all their lives, a lot of them. I mean, they're activists who are deeply concerned about the future of our country, and I welcome their involvement. We need to change the direction of our country.
To talk about changing the direction of the country and also the level of partisanship, are there some certain ways in which that elected leaders, people in the media can actually reduce the partisanship, change the tone in Washington? For example, in California, they're trying to tinker with their redistricting. And oftentimes where you have congressional districts are set up where the most conservative person wins conservative districts, the most liberal person wins liberal districts. And when you get those two people in a room, they can't agree on anything. But if you somehow change redistricting, you get some more centrist, more practical candidates. Are there some ways in which politicians and also the news media can reduce partisanship in Washington?
Well, as I said before, it's the people who are ultimately going to reduce partisanship. I think by nature, Washington is made up of two camps, and we're going to see whether or not a political decision is really made for those two camps to cooperate. I think people were really satisfied in that 94 to 98 period when they saw a balanced budget, they saw welfare reform, those kinds of things. Again, I think structurally, California is interesting in leading the way. You've got to redo redistricting. You see California passed by 58% a referendum so that they're going to have nonpartisan primaries from now on. That will bring the power of moderate voters. It will enhance the power of those voters in primaries, and that could make a real difference. Again, I go back to that poll. You know, no one is really behind any of the things that the people asked for, like national referenda. You know, the California system actually seems to be ahead of things, you know, in terms of both electing people who didn't come from the traditional party structure and then actually beginning to change the system to make it more 21st century.
Now, some critics might end up saying that the referendum process in California has made that state almost so ungovernable because you have so many pieces of referenda coming and it has burdens on the elected leaders in the state to actually be able to produce a budget. Is it possible to have the voice of democracy and make it a smoother process?
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair comment. I think that national referenda would have to be worked out. I'm just saying that in the 21st century, voters are asking for some more direct power. They don't want to just elect people. They want to have some more direct power. First of all, they want to at least directly elect the president, and then they want to have more input into the rest of the system. And whether it's some kind of tailored national referenda, we can't be afraid of democracy. We've been founded on the basis of democracy, and of course democracy sometimes makes bad choices, but not having democracy makes consistently worse choices than having it.
I do think we need more competitive districts. I mean, this election, we're looking at, they're talking 95 or 100 House districts that are still in play, which is a huge number at this point, 2 weeks before the election, but that's less than a fourth of the seats in the U.S. Congress. That means more than 75% of the seats are basically so one-sided that even in this very contentious year, they're a lock for either party, and I don't think that's good for democracy. So I think there ought to be more competitive districts. You know, they used to joke in Texas that if you drove your car with both doors open through one of the congressional districts, you'd wipe out half the constituents because it was so gerrymandered. It was drawn as this long, narrow line just to elect a certain person. And so we really do need more fairly drawn districts, and I don't know what the ultimate solution is to that. But, you know, having come from a state where it's hard for people to remember now, but when my boss, President Bush, was elected in 2000, one of the things that appealed to him, about him to people across the country was that he had worked with Democrats in Texas to get things done. People would talk to me about, you know, he worked with that Democrat lieutenant governor. How did he ever do that? And so I think people do like that. The problem is, from both the media perspective and from the special interest perspective, you come to Washington and you get pushed to the far extremes. The special interest groups expect complete adherence to their points of view on both the left and the right, and the media tends to cover the most strident voices. And so we get pushed to the extremes from both ends of the spectrum.
We'll also talk about the nature of how media has changed from the time that you left the White House, where things are so much faster. There are probably people here in the audience who are tweeting this. You have instant blogs, that the news cycle has changed. How would you, if you had to go back and work on a campaign or back in a White House, deal with just the fast-changing world of the media?
It's unbelievable how different it is. And my best analogy is in the 2000 presidential campaign, none of us on the Bush campaign had a BlackBerry. And we all thought, frankly, that Al Gore was a little weird when we heard he was using this device to email Tipper. By the 2004 campaign, I could not imagine running a campaign, much less my life, without my appropriately nicknamed Crackberry. And so, I mean, that's just an example. I mean, today, you're right. I mean, there's not, my colleague at Burson, the head of our digital practice, says there's no longer a 24-hour news cycle. It's a 40-minute news cycle. That's how many minutes there are in a day, how many opportunities you have to, tweet out the latest news or update your Facebook. And so, it's just a very, when I first got involved in the political process, the news magazines really dominated the political coverage. It was the once-a-week news magazines that you were most worried about during the first President Bush's presidency. What was on the cover of Time and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report was the thing in the White House you worried most about. By the time I got to the White House, they were important, but they weren't certainly the dominant. You were more worried about the immediate and what was going out on the CNN and Fox and the headline news and the wire services, and now it's what's going out, what's being tweeted. So it's really, I think the explosion of information is good in the sense Mark made the point that voters today are very informed and they have a lot of information, and that's all very healthy. I do worry about whether people have time to think in our political process. I remember when I was in the White House, there was a problem on the electric grid it was sometime after September 11th, and a bunch of the power went out in the Northeast. And there was some concern about whether it might have been a terrorist attack. And so President Bush didn't say anything while he was waiting to find out more about what had caused it. And it took 4 hours before the White House issued a statement. Well, you would think, I mean, the media was just appalled. 4 hours. The White House went 4 hours and didn't, I mean, they were just, it was unbelievable how many stories mentioned that. Well, 4 hours is not very long to assess a situation and to think about it and to think about what you want to say about it. And so I think we do have to think through the ramifications on decision making when things are so frenetic in today's news cycle.
Though 4 hours is the length of 2 disaster movies.
Mark, you mentioned some specific ways that the Obama administration can perhaps be able to seize 2011 and 2012 to their advantage looking into the re-elect. But talk about sometimes how the political mood that, for example, dealing with a 10% unemployment, how hard it might be for the White House to change the overall dynamics of a race if the unemployment doesn't start to go down. Are there things that are maybe outside of their control, and if the unemployment goes down, he'll get reelected, and if it stays around where it is now, then he's in trouble?
Well, first, let me just pick up for a minute or two on where Karen was on the change in the media and roll that into kind of what, the change of the environment. When I polled for 6 years for Clinton in the White House, pretty much, I took the Washington Post headlines and I'd look at USA Today. And it was hard enough to get people in Washington really outside of the Beltway to understand that USA Today had the headlines that people were really thinking about, and the Washington Post really had in the Beltway. Now, what's happened now is it's really kind of changed somewhat, because now the information system is so much more distributed that stories ripple through from the Beltway. I've got one CEO who said that he prepared all year for speeches, and the only speech anyone heard was one that he gave to Scandinavian students. Why? Because someone can say anything, anywhere, and that can become, a national news story of great import of the moment. So never before have we had this kind of political connection across people, easy and convenient. there's no question that the primary source of news and information over the next few years will become the smartphone. By the time, usually the old pattern was you worked all day, you got home, maybe had a little dinner, turned on the nightly news, and that was really the most important event of the day. By the time you get to the nightly news, it's done. You've had a continuous flash of news and interest, all through the day. I have colleagues who've probably been through the Drudge Report 26 times by the end of the day. People are really tuned in and plugged in the way that before only people who were kind of inside the bubble really were tuned into the 24-hour news cycle. So it's a totally different news environment. It's particularly different, I think, as younger people come up. And it's interesting that we did one focus group, and it was a discussion of newspapers, and people said, well, like what's a newspaper? Right? So what do you name our news source now? It's not a TV network. It's not a newspaper. It's not exactly a website. What is it? How do we get our news? And I think that's going to be, the fundamental new environment that we're still really learning how to handle and deal with. Now, that news environment then can create a greater capacity for, what you'd call mass action at a moment's notice than ever before. And that's where you can have more swings, whether it's in the stock market or in the voting market, than ever before, because information will spread within hours to huge segments of the population. And then you come back to the question, well, so what's the president to do in this highly volatile news environment if he doesn't improve the economy? Well, first, the president's going to have to improve the economy. The fundamental bond that presidents form with people that become unbreakable are based on keeping your promises when you got elected. That's why Clinton survived the events of 1998, because he created 24 million jobs, and he had promised 24 million jobs. That's also why I think Bush in 2006 had such problems, because he didn't end the Iraq War, and he didn't do basically the things, he didn't end either the partisanship in Washington. And so I think people said, at that point, you hadn't done it after 6 years. President Obama's got 2 years to keep some basic commitments. He's kept some commitments on health care, on financial reform, on beginning to change the system. He's not getting the full credit. Look, if you were sitting in the White House, you'd say, hey, we did health care reform, we did financial reform, we did a stimulus package that may not have achieved full results, but it stopped, everyone agrees, stopped an economic collapse. They're sitting there and saying, look, if we continue the policies, they're going to bear fruit, and they're going to show that we're the right direction to keep moving the country forward. And I think it's going to be a basic choice between forward or back. I think they've tried to make that choice, but not as strongly as I think they'd have to make it or be able to make it in 2012. And the question that you raise is, well, what happens if they don't have that kind of, the kind of economic improvement that they really need? It's going to be a difficult environment. It's then going to come down to, difference in philosophy and difference in candidates. The Republican Party may have a structural problem that started here with the Tea Party. If Sarah Palin is the Republican nominee for president, I don't care whether unemployment is 15%. I do not believe she will be elected.
To you, how do you look at the emerging 2012 Republican field? And we can talk about Sarah Palin and everyone else, but as Mark was mentioning a little bit, there are some people who see, Republicans, for example, as the Bush campaign did in 2004, you need to win about 40%, if not more, of the Latino vote. You need to be able to make inroads in places that you haven't been successful. That's why the Bush compassionate conservatism benefited you guys so well. Look at the Republican Party as we had in the 2012, and who are some stars, and what does the Republican Party need to do to be able to win?
Well, I think we have to show that we can make government work. That's what people really want, and that's what they're so frustrated about right now, because government just is not working. I mean, talk about gridlock. We're seeing gridlock. No jobs, no improvement, we've gone nowhere, basically, for a couple years. So it's interesting because people describe this as an anti-incumbent election, but that really doesn't sum it up, especially when you look at the governor's races taking place around the country. We're poised. I was at a meeting of the Republican Governors Association a couple of weeks ago, and Haley Barbour's done a fantastic job as chairman of that organization. We're poised, we think, to have 30 Republican governors after this election. Why? Well, you know what? 6 of the 6 incumbent Republican governors, including Governor Rick Perry in my home state of Texas, who are up for re-election this year, are expected to win re-election. Of the 7 Democrat governors who are up, 6 of the 7 are viewed as vulnerable. What's the difference? The Republicans are making government work at the state level. They're governing based on limited government. They're focusing on things, priorities in government like education and health. My friend Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, inherited a budget deficit, has turned it into, got rid of the deficit, has worked to create jobs in that state. Governor Tim Pawlenty in Minnesota has a great record. Haley Barbour, Bobby Jindal. I mean, Rick Perry in Texas. We're looking at Republican governors across the country who have really made government work for people and made it effective. And they have a record to run on, they have results to run on, and that's what I think they are going to have and President Obama is not going to have in the 2012 election cycle.
So you think that the future of the Republican Party is with the governors?
Well, I may be a little prejudiced because obviously I came from a governor's office and I saw a governor is a chief executive of a state. A governor has experience working with legislators, setting vision, setting a direction and achieving results. That's where I think you're seeing President Obama's weakness right now. He does not have that executive experience. He's a legislator. He basically sublet his program to Nancy Pelosi and the House to write his legislation. And so that's the problem right now. That's why I think we are not seeing the kind of policies, the kind of leadership that you would have expected. And so I personally think that governors are really a CEO of a state, and people are going to be very suspicious about rhetoric in 2012. We've tried that. The change thing didn't work out so well. People believed in it, and maybe their expectations were too high, but they have definitely been dashed. And so I think people are going to be very skeptical about rhetoric in the 2012 race, and they're going to be looking at results.
As we head into 2011 with the presidential primary season, as a bunch of people will parachute into Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, looking at what's happened in Republican primaries across the country, where in most cases the most conservative Republican has won. Certainly George W. Bush didn't win his primary in 2000 by being the most conservative. He tried to actually position himself to be the best general election candidate with his message that he had in Texas. Does it concern you a little bit that perhaps the Republican race in 2011 might be the race of who's most conservative?
Well, again, I really do believe, and what worked for Governor Bush was compassionate conservatism. Obviously said, I'm a conservative, but I'm a conservative who's optimistic and hopeful. I believe, I believe that conservative philosophy can be compassionate and hopeful. So I would hope that would be the kind of tone that we set. But in 2012, people are going to be, I think, looking for someone who can make our government work. And I believe that there are a lot of Republican governors across the country who've got great records to run on, and they will be running not on who's most conservative, but look what I've done. You want to cut spending? I've cut spending. You want to show how to balance a budget? I've balanced a budget. You want to have economic development and jobs? We know the way. We look what we've done in our states to achieve greater private sector investment and growth. And so I think those are the kind of things that people will resonate with in 2012.
Mark, what are your thoughts on the Republican Party going into 2012?
Well, I got to go back to the math, which is 2/3 or more of those people who consider themselves Republican, and particularly Republican primary voters, are conservative. Almost zero liberals, and the rest moderate. So that means that they've got well over, and if the Republican Party or primary voters are about a quarter of the country, let's say 26%, it means that with 13, 14%, you can dominate the Republican primaries. And we're seeing the most conservative movements gather the most energy and enthusiasm, in the party. You're seeing the Tea Party, nominate not the strong, not this litany of really established governors that Karen went through, but the O'Donnells of the world. And so there's an inherent instability right now in the Republican Party. It may not come out in this election, but I sure think it's going to come out in the presidential election. And that instability is that whatever moderate wing that there was, and the ability for Bush, who ran as more of a moderate, and I think took a lot of the moderates in order to bring the 2000 election to at least a draw. I think that right now there's a war within the party, and I think because people want so many choices, the party is dissembling, and the primary process could bring that, because what is the party going to do if in fact Sarah Palin, who has the growing name recognition, highest enthusiasm, boy, I would bet that she'll have an incredible organization in Iowa, wins the primary. What is the party going to do? And if they're going to back their candidates to the end, I don't think that she's got a chance of winning. And whether she has a chance of winning, she's becoming emblematic of the Republican Party, whose ratings, as you pointed out, have fallen even lower than the Democratic Party. So I think that the party itself, really has some structural problems here that are coming out and playing themselves out. It's not unusual for the party that's out of power to have these problems. Democrats had these problems until they resolved it, and it's now Republicans' turn.
Well, just a final word on that. I think that all the governors I mentioned would be offended if you did not say they were strong conservatives, because they are, and they ran with great conservative support. I'm a conservative. They ran with support. They've got, what I think is important for our party, and what the Tea Party has reminded our party, is that we need to go back to our roots, our core beliefs in limited government and cutting spending. And some of the frustration that you've seen with the Republican Party was that when we controlled Congress, frankly, we spent too much money. And the Tea Party has reminded us of that. Sarah Palin's been articulate about that. And I think that our governors have taken heed of that. And they've cut budgets and cut spending. And so I think that, again, that the 2012 presidential election is going to be a great and true philosophical debate. And we didn't see that in 2008, frankly, because a lot of people thought that President Obama was a lot more moderate than his policies have turned out to be. Clearly, he likes spending money. He believes in government solutions to problems. Republicans believe in unleashing the private sector and we know the private sector, not government, creates jobs. We know that we need to properly limit government. And so there will be a great philosophical debate in 2012, and I believe that puts Republicans at a natural advantage because this is a center-right country.
There are Democrats and progressives out there who said President Obama didn't go left enough on health care. He didn't have the public option. And there are even people say that one of the front runners for president on the Republican side, Mitt Romney, the health care that he initiated while in Massachusetts as a governor was very similar to what President Obama did on the federal level.
Well, I think that's why Mark's been talking about fissures in the Republican Party. I think the Democratic Party has some real fissures when you look at an incumbent president who most of the country now thinks his policies are too liberal, but yet the liberals are saying they're not liberal enough. And they're disappointed pressures that he's going to be under as he tries to negotiate his re-election campaign in 2012.
Well, although I'll say that even though Democrats are an outspoken party and there are differences and even some criticisms, the truth of the matter, when you look at them in the polls, Democrats are 100% cohesive, behind the president, behind giving him an opportunity to keep moving his policies forward. When you look at the numbers, it's actually much more, Democrats are voting more solidly Democratic than Republicans are voting Republican these days.
Mark, a final question before we start turning to some of the questions from the audience. You found yourself a little bit in the news when Bob Woodward on cable TV was starting to talk about a potential switcheroo and move Hillary Clinton from Secretary of State to Vice President and have Vice President Biden become Secretary of State. Can you shed a little bit of light on that? Do you think it would happen in 2012? And do you think that Hillary Clinton might decide to do that or perhaps try to run for president in 2016?
I think Woodward was having a little fun with the media, trying to blow something up from years, speculation, and I don't think it's happening. I think that the president's got a strong team. I think Hillary's doing a great job as Secretary of State. Biden's out there as a very strong vice president, and I think, part of what I think Obama's showing is that he's got a team and he's going to move forward with that team.
Great. Well, we'd love to start some questions from the audience, so please fire away. And the microphone's right up there.
Don't be shy.
I guess this question's directed to Ms. Hughes. If a lot of these Tea Party candidates or Tea Party-backed candidates win their Senate and congressional races, do you think they'll demand an over-proportional amount of power in Congress? And if so, do you envision a shutdown in government like there was in '95?
That's a good question. I don't envision that. What I hope is that they'll demand some changes, and we need some changes. I think they'll shake things up a little bit, and that's what the voters are saying. They don't want business as usual. That's what they said in 2008, and no one seems to be listening. And so I do think they will come to Washington, and they'll try to you know, shake things up a little. And frankly, that's probably healthy. You know, we've all seen that sometimes people can be in office for a long period of time and get used to the way things have always been done, and you know, it might be a breath of fresh air to have some changes. I don't think you'll see the kind of government shutdown efforts that you saw in the past. Again, you know, if what happens, if Republicans take the House and not the Senate, or if Republicans take both the House and the Senate, I still think it's in neither party's interest to try to shut the government down. I think, you know, there was a lot of that did not inure to the Republicans' benefit the last time that happened, and I wouldn't expect that to happen. No, but I do think they will be a voice of conscience and remind their colleagues of what the voters said in this election.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Aren't there some inherent contradictions? So on the one hand, we want to reduce the level of partisanship, change the tone, but then there are candidates who might end up winning who said, my entire rationale for running is to oppose President Obama on all these policies to...
Well, let me disagree with that a little bit, because, for example, let's get realistic about a Tea Party race. In Florida, we have an Hispanic Republican, Marco Rubio, strongly supported by the Tea Party, great guy who achieved great things as Speaker of the Florida House, worked closely with popular incumbent Governor Jeb Bush. He has not only talked about the need to change the way we've done things in Washington, he's also given ideas for things we can do better. He went around the state of Florida and asked Florida voters he did an idea raiser and published a book with 100 ideas that Floridians had to improve their state. And so, you know, I think let's look at what's really happening in a lot of these races with a lot of these candidates. So we've got an articulate Hispanic Republican with a great family story, very charismatic, who I think when he wins that Florida Senate race, which I expect him to, and the polls now show he's ahead, will become a big leader in the Republican Party. And that's good for our party, and that's good for what you talked about, our need to outreach to Hispanic voters in 2012.
Although I don't think, in fairness, he's not really the Tea Party poster child. And I think implied, though, in the gentleman's question is this fear and concern about if the Republicans got power, who exactly are you electing, right? And I think that actually has put the brakes on the momentum that the Republicans had. I think going into the summer, the Republicans had unbelievable momentum. And I think exactly that question, well, look, I was there in '94 when Gingrich thought it was a good idea to shut down the government, and we polled and said, hey, let's see, you know, that will boomerang, and it did. So I doubt the Republicans will do that one again, but they'll come up with something else. You know, they'll stop the, you know, they'll stop the national debt in some way, so that, you know, some other tripwire that could be, you know, seen as destructive rather than constructive. But I don't know what they're going to do and how it's going to work out. But implied in his question is the fear and concern that maybe there's a Rubio in Florida, but there's an O'Donnell in Delaware.
Please, more questions.
Hi, this is for both of you. Can you name some individual races that might be under the radar right at this point that on election day we're going to be surprised by as to someone winning that just hasn't been covered in the media maybe adequately or at all?
Well, there's a couple races I'm watching. I was in Alabama, was it yesterday? Just yesterday, campaigning for a woman named Martha Roby, who is running, it's Alabama 2, the 2nd congressional district. She's running against a Democrat named Bobby Bright, who's, I think it's a good representative race because he's a first term, won in 2008. He's the former mayor of Montgomery. She's a very effective city councilwoman in Montgomery who's got a very diverse district and is viewed as someone who's really able to work with people. A very attractive candidate. And, you know, it's sort of a representative race about whether Democrats can still win seats outside of urban or minority districts in the South. And so that's one of the ones I'm watching. I'm watching a race in Texas where there's a longtime incumbent Democrat, Chet Edwards. Frankly, it's one of the most Republican congressional seats in the country that's still held by a Democrat. He's managed to survive for a number of years, but we've got a very strong challenger, a businessman named Bill Flores. And I think this might be the year that we can elect a Republican in that district. There's a couple of at-large seats in North and South Dakota, where in North Dakota, longtime Congressman Earl Pomeroy's been there 9 terms. Apparently is facing a real fight. Same thing in South Dakota in their congressional seat. There are a couple of races in Florida and Ohio. So I think really from the House that you're probably not hearing as much about the individual races as you may have the Senate. In terms of governor, I think some really, I mean, you're hearing about California. I think that's a really interesting race. It's interesting because the polls would show that Jerry Brown has the edge, but when I talk to my friends in California, they tell me that even their Democrat friends are voting for Meg Whitman because they know that California has enormous problems. And I, for one, just can't imagine a state facing the kind of enormous problems they're facing that they're going to go back to Jerry Brown. And so I think that's an interesting race. And then, of course, the governor's race in Florida is very interesting. The governor's race there we were there last night, and it's viewed as being tied. Talk about an ugly race. The ads are really, really nasty and negative, and so it'll be very interesting. Florida and Ohio, obviously, because of our experiences in the 2000 and 2004 presidential race, are states that I watch very closely. I'm excited about Ohio. I think my friend Rob Portman and John Kasich are about to be elected governor and senator there, and so you know, that's a really good news for our party, and if we can really solidify our leadership in Ohio.
Mark?
Yeah, no, I agree with Karen. We've been traveling to a lot of the same places. We're going to come out, we've been polling actually 42 marginal districts, and we're going to come out, I think, with another 10 either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And, you know, if you go through those races, you'll find that there are 5 or 6 that the Democrats are clearly winning, and from the original 42. And so fundamentally, I think the untold story, and you could check the individual races, the untold story is when the Republicans expanded their targets, they had to expand their targets because they were not going to get the transfer in Congress out of the districts that they had targeted. I think that to me, the Reid race is really fascinating. I think if Reid gets reelected, that's going to be a big reaffirmation of Democrats in the direction of the Senate. You know, again, I think here's where the Tea Party came in and changed the nominating process. Though the race is still polling extremely close, I think that the likelihood here that you're going to have the clash between, core Democratic leadership, versus Tea Party in Nevada, and if Reid wins, I think that's going to be a very big reaffirmation for the party.
And I think very bad for the country. I mean, other than Speaker Pelosi, Harry Reid is one of the has one of the lowest favorables. I think his favorables are only 15% or something. And so I really do urge my fellow Republicans in Nevada to do everything they can to win that election.
I'm going to urge fellow Democrats to do everything they can to keep Reid in office against the Tea Party candidate.
One race that a lot of people aren't talking about is the Alaska Senate race that we're not going to know about well into the evening on election night. In fact, maybe another 3 weeks afterwards on trying to count all those write-in ballots. But the Republican Joe Miller, Lisa Murkowski running as a write-in, and Scott McAdams, the Democrat, who's been running some pretty provocative ads. And so if there's one race that's going to completely surprise you, that's the one to keep an eye on. And but you're going to have to stay up really late at night to find out what's going on.
There might be quite a few of those stay up really late at nights because of all the absentee ballots, too. In places like Florida, there's a lot of counting to do.
Thank you to both of you for being here today. One of the things I've heard Obama staunch supporters, who aren't Democrats first, but Obama supporters first, say is that although they're disappointed that we might lose the House, it'll actually be good for his re-election prospects. I was wondering what you guys think about the theory that Obama wins by losing.
Mark, turn to you because it's very similar.
Look, even I have to admit that's a bit of spin. I think, look, it'd be better for the president to keep both houses of Congress if possible. I mean, I think that, again, that would be a reaffirmation of his leadership, the direction of taking the country, and I think it would then strengthen the resolve of those Democrats who were there and didn't lose to say, hey, we're there, we have the majority, let's move forward, let's press the accelerator pedal down, because we know that we can do that and win even with nearly 10% unemployment. And I think that would actually be a powerful message. I think if we wind up losing the House, as I said before, Republicans are going to have to make a key decision, sit there and say no for 2 years, or try to work in the way that Gingrich and Clinton did. And then the whole question of investigations is going to come up. The Republicans will have subpoena power. They haven't had it in a few years. The tendency is from, whether you go back to, 1954 on, which is that every time they get that subpoena power, we go back to a series of investigations. And so that may play out, that may backfire, as sometimes it does, but I think that'll be one of the big changes that would happen here if the Republicans won the House.
I actually have Republican friends who think that it might, just in thinking about the presidential race only, that it's better for President Obama if we don't win the House, because that will force him to moderate his positions, to compromise, and that therefore will set him up better for re-election. I don't agree with that. I think that we really can't afford what's happening in Washington, and we need to take the House at least so that we can begin to chip away and change some of the, these massive pieces of legislation that have been passed with not much regard for the incredible consequences. I think we need to start, beginning to chip away at those and beginning to challenge at least the president by proposing cuts in spending, by proposing cuts in the deficit, by proposing changes to the health care bill.
You could propose those things even without the House.
Hi. There's been a lot of discontent with the two-party system being, Republicans and Democrats, and some people say that the Tea Party is the answer to that. Do you think that that is the case? And if not, what do you think is out there that would go one way or the other?
I think the Tea Party really, the way I look at it is we've seen the rise of two really big populist movements in the last few years. The first one rose up to elect President Obama because people were hungry for a change, and he was able to inspire people. The second rose up in direct opposition to President Obama's policies, and that was the Tea Party. And so I really do think that it's by and large a movement that is basically trying to restore the Republican Party to core principles of less, less government, less spending, lower taxes. And so I don't really see it as a separate party. I see it as more of a reminder to Republicans of what we really stand for.
Well, look, I think if you look back here from 1980, and I actually polled for John Anderson, if you look back, there have been a few attempts at independent movements, Anderson, Perot. Perot got farther, but Perot turned out to be, take more votes, I think, from the Republican than he did the Democrat. I think the Tea Party, just like Move On, the Tea Party lives within the Republican Party. I don't think it's attracting a significant number of voters outside that. If for a third party to be successful, it actually has to draw almost equal numbers from Democrats and Republicans. Again, if you go to the math of the thing, if it draws mostly from the Republican Party, it's a Republican spoiler. If it's an enhanced Ralph Nader that got 10 or 15%, it would be a Democratic spoiler. It will take someone who hits the moderate center, has a combination, most likely of being more socially liberal and economically conservative. And so either the two parties are going to have to do as they do each presidential cycle and move to cover the middle. I mean, we really saw President Clinton cover the middle in '92. When he wasn't governing that way, he came back and governed that way, and we had some of the highest satisfaction, equal to the satisfaction that we had under President Reagan. I think you saw then President Bush take the center, and then he lost the center, particularly by 2006, and ended with 2008, with some of the lowest ratings of a president who did not face indictment for anything. And then I think you saw Obama take the center in the last election, and now is losing a lot of the independent voters and has 2 years to come back. I think if you run out the various scenarios, if unemployment were to stay high, Sarah Palin got the Republican nomination, I think you'd probably see people come in with an independent movement. Remember, the Supreme Court here, it's also interesting that what's happened to the economics of politics. Despite the effort of campaign finance reform, money is flooding into politics like never before. I mean, I used to say that America runs its democracy on less than the advertising budget of a hamburger, okay? That's no longer the case. On the low side, the internet is bringing in giving as a tradition that never existed before. When I was originally working with the Democratic Party in '96, I did a poll of Democratic donors. First, the list was pretty small. I think I exhausted it, and the median age of the list was 74. Right? There were no small donors. There was no tradition of being involved in politics to the extent of giving any money. And then on the high side, I had lunch with someone from Karen's side of the aisle who said corporate money was flooding in, okay, and that, you know, didn't quite know what to do with it all. So I think you're seeing this enormous flood. So what's going to happen here is either the parties are going to cover the middle, or new movements, or someone who's got $1 billion or more is going to come in and again try to push the envelope the way Ross Perot did. And this time you're seeing, again, you would see in the case of a Palin 10% unemployment scenario, again, conditions that would be difficult for both parties if the Republicans are too far to the right and conditions don't improve. The likelihood is that conditions will improve, Obama will pick up as Clinton did, and that opening that exists now is likely to close. But it's not guaranteed.
A running theme of tonight's discussion has been increased choice for the voters and putting more power back in their hands. And in a few weeks, Californians are going to decide on a measure that would put the responsibility of redistricting back in their hands. And I wonder if you have any comment on that system and its likelihood of producing a more fair and competitive district map, as opposed to a system that is controlled by the state legislature, vetoed by the governor, like might happen in Texas.
Is it a nonpartisan panel? Is that how would they draw the
Yes,
districts?
it's actually a fairly complicated system drawn from a group of citizens that meet certain requirements, like having never worked in government before, never held positions related to. They're, seated 6 from each, and then 2 from nonpartisan, and so forth. But they would be average
I'm not familiar enough with how that
citizens.
system is done, but as I said earlier, I do think we need more competitive districts. Now, from a Republican perspective, I will say that the sense in our party is that for a long time, redistricting was done to keep Republicans' strength down. For example, we have much more Republican strength in Texas than we have congressional districts. If you look at voting patterns in my state of Texas. So I think, obviously, if you're a Republican, as I am, you think the districts ought to be drawn fairly to reflect your voting strength. On the other hand, I do worry that there's so many seats that are viewed as safe for one party or another, and I think it's important for our democracy that we have more competitive congressional elections. I'm not sure that I've thought enough about which exact system. It's sort of like the Mark was talking about the voters. There's a lot of talk about nonpartisan selection of judges. Well, I worry about that as a Republican, because what does that mean? Sometimes that means that liberal interests are the ones who are viewed as nonpartisan. So it depends on what your definition of nonpartisan is too. Is it truly fair and nonpartisan, or is it a ploy to let some special interest group make those decisions? And so I always worry a little when you take things out of the hands of elected representatives, or you take things out of the hands of voters, such as the selection of judges, because this committee that's formed, who controls the makeup of that committee, and is it really fair or not?
Yeah, I just think, as I said before, that the system of redistricting has gotten to be too political, that any legislature that has the advantage pushes its advantage to the maximum that it legally can, and that I think that this movement for more nonpartisan redistricting, I think, is a promising movement. Now, if you think about it, if there are more competitive districts on each side, that means in an election year, you're likely to get even more swings in the House than you're seeing now. You'd have, instead of 40, 50, or 60 seats being competitive, you'd have something more like 120 or 130 seats, which would certainly make for some elections that were more subject to the will of the people.
But this is an example, again, of the money discussion we had. Mark talked about money flooding into the system from corporate interests this time. Well, where were the people talking about money flooding in from union interests in 2008? There were record amounts of money spent to elect President Obama, special interest money from the left, often with the donors undisclosed in 2008. And I don't recall the president making comments about it, as he has directed toward more pro-business interests in this election cycle. And so it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think the same applies to whether something is really nonpartisan or not.
Next question.
First, thank you both for coming. I really enjoyed the back and forth. There was an article in the Hill newspaper this afternoon that came out and talked about President Obama taking a 10-day trip to Asia after the election, while the Congress focuses on kind of what they're going to do during lame duck and kind of what the agenda is going forward. Some of the Democratic strategists have already come out and said that this is really going to cede some of the momentum to the Republican Party. I just want to kind of get a reaction from both of you to see if you think that is the case, or what kind of impact that might be, because I know that President Clinton had done the same thing as well.
Yeah, Mark, you can take a stab at that. I think that trip has been in the works for a very long time, as far as a lot of President Obama's travel. But it certainly would, particularly if his party takes a big haircut on Election Day, would have an image problem, perhaps.
Well, good, he's answered that one. No, look, I think you're going to have to balance. You know, sometimes the calendar isn't all politics. And so sometimes especially in a long political period like we've had, and a long period of focus on some domestic issues, sometimes a trip just has to be when it has to be, even if it might not. You know, so trips like that, they sometimes get shortchanged, or most likely Obama will then do more media appearances while on the trip to both show him working and to have him communicating, you know, back home. And that's most likely what he'll do.
Yeah, that can go a couple of ways. You can, when the president is traveling overseas, you can look less relevant to the debate in America, or you can look more presidential, as you do big events and things. And so I personally think in this case, particularly if he takes big losses in the election, that it's probably not an ideal time to be that far away for that long, and would give some advantage to Republicans to be able to try to set the agenda and talk about their vision and what they're going to accomplish. But as Mark said, sometimes you can't control that either. I mean, as president, you have obligations, and I'm not familiar with the obligations of this trip, but clearly our relationships with countries in Asia are very important to our country.
And sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, you know, screaming for the president overseas can also be a pretty good picture for the president.
Next question.
I know that a couple of the themes that were mentioned tonight had to do with sort of voter discontent, increasing polarization of the parties in Congress, and then also this sort of sense that government is dysfunctional. And one of the biggest issues, of course, is the debt and how we address spending and reform entitlements. And so just wondering what you think about given the likelihood of divided government, what is the likelihood that the Deficit Commission will actually produce something that the President can support and that will actually pass through Congress, given sort of the trajectory of the partisanship that's taking place?
Karen, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, it's obviously difficult because it's been tried for a number of years. And I think that's one of the things that's caused so much angst about health care, is the idea that we've added this massive new entitlement when we haven't even figured out how to pay for the entitlements that we're already obligated for. Plus, we have this mounting deficit that we haven't addressed. And so, you know, they've got their work cut out for them. I don't know what they're going to come forward with. We've seen in the election cycle that some candidates who stuck their necks out and tried to make specific proposals get criticized for it when they try to make some suggestions. You're seeing in France right now what happens when, for example, he was suggesting raising the retirement age to try to reduce some of the structural deficit in their programs. And so, you know, it's difficult, but I do think that perhaps we've arrived at a time when people truly believe, as I said earlier, that the path we're on is not sustainable, and that we're going to have to do something about it. You know, I do some work for the Speaker of the Texas House, Joe Strauss, and he wrote a column that he sent out and got a lot of people listened to it. He talked about my daughter's debt. And he talked in personal terms as a parent about how he is worried as a fiscal conservative about the kind of debt that we're piling on to our children. And I think more people have brought that up to him than almost anything else he's ever sent out, because people are really, truly worried And, you know, it feels a little different to me this time, as if people may reward someone who actually comes forward with a plan that sounds like reasonable ideas to begin to try to address this. And so I guess I'm optimistic in terms of my hopes that could happen. I'm also realistic that the political realities are very challenging.
But, you know, let's remember what happened, and I was there in the '96 and the Budget Balance Accord, which Erskine Bowles, who's heading this commission, really helped spearhead, you know, that effort as well. No one would have predicted, right, that Gingrich and Clinton would really make, you know, what has to be a grand bargain. And here's where, you know, bipartisanship, you know, can work at its finest, because to be successful, these things have to give the Republicans some of what they really want and the Democrats some of what they really want. They can't just take a Democratic idea and water it down a little bit to get 1 or 2 votes. It really has to be a grand bargain. And so it's got to be a grand bargain, you know, on the deficit. It's got to be one on taxes. It's got to be one on entitlements. You know, the commission report is either going to be a springboard to exactly that kind of hard bargaining, or it's just going to go on the shelf. I don't think, based on history, you should prejudge that. You know, just when you prejudge that nothing's going to happen and you've got 2 extremely apparently partisan people like Clinton and Gingrich, you wind up with a balanced budget accord. The same thing could happen. We should be rooting for it. And ultimately, it's what the voters are looking for. They're not looking for one side of, you know, cutting taxes and cutting spending without the other side of keeping entitlements whole, without figuring out, you know, how to keep the costs down from growing too much on health care. They were looking for a grand bargain that resolves these things. That's what the last one was. And what happened last time was the budget got balanced and we ran into surplus in only a couple of years. And neither Clinton nor Gingrich expected that would happen. So if you get too much bogged down in the conventional wisdom, I think you lose sight of what the American system really can and does produce at moments you least expect it to.
And Mark makes a really important point there. I think both parties have to be able to hold their nose at a little something in the other. It's not just watering down and making it sound like it's got to include something that the Republicans really want and the Democrats really don't like, and something that the Democrats probably really want and the Republicans really don't like. And that's where you can genuinely find some consensus. And I do think that people are very practical, and the time may be right for something like that.
Next question.
I'd like to direct this question to you, Mr. Penn. You mentioned before that the re-election of Senator Harry Reid would be a rallying point for Democrats and be maybe a morale booster. But in the House, among a lot of Democrats that are up in tight re-election races, there's been a lot of discord with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's agenda and what she's been doing, and there have been many, you know, Bobby Bright, for one, who has highlighted his voting record against Nancy Pelosi and with John Boehner. So what does that dynamic in the House, how does that affect what you foresee going on after the elections with morale among House Democrats?
Well, again, morale with House Democrats is really going to depend on how the House does. I think ultimately, you know, the 94 elections, in which after, you know, if you go back, you know, in the 94 elections, there was health care, there was a tax increase, there was gun legislation. There were a lot of votes that people took for good bills that really were good for America, but they took a lot of hits when it came to 94. And that also, I think, made a lot of Democrats gun shy for a while. Now, in this case, that's why I said before, you know, if the Republicans fall just a little short here and the Democrats keep the House, well, that will be a big morale booster for the House, because then Democrats will say, you know what, we can take the tough votes for the president and we can still move forward and stay in the House. That will be a tremendous booster. So those are the 2 boosters. You know, if the House goes down, I think you're right. It's not going to be, you know, there'll be a lot of resumes out here in Washington, D.C., and a lot of people looking for jobs who had them, and a lot of people moving into offices, you know, who didn't have them. I think on the Senate side, I think the Reid thing, and I think the fact that it looked like the Republicans, you know, could take the Senate until some of these Tea Party nominees came into place. I think holding the Senate and holding Reid will be really good morale boosters. Again, the president is going to have to assess with his advisors after the midterms what it looks like. President Clinton in '94 felt walloped by the midterms. He didn't expect the losses to be as big as they were, and he realized he had 2 years to really move his administration to the center and win the trust of the American people that he didn't have. He had much lower numbers than President Obama had, and he was facing a much more united Republican Party in Gingrich. Right now, I think neither of those conditions is as severe, and it's going to be up to the president to rally the Democrats, after this thing, and to restore morale, I think, to the entire country. So let's not judge the election until it's over.
And we'll see what happens, but I do remember, it's a very divisive after a loss. So if the Democrats do lose that, I remember the Republicans in 2006, I remember going to the Senate dining room, and there was clearly a lot of bitterness there. Nobody likes to lose in the political process, and when it involves things like, your committee assignments and whether you're the chairman or not, and so control is a big deal to people in Congress. And so I do think that if the Democrats lose the House, that there will be a lot of consternation with Speaker Pelosi for some votes she forced the House to take, for example, on climate change that was really meaningless. It was going nowhere, but it really put Democrats in industrial states and in coal states. It really, really forced them to take a tough vote that could, in fact, cost some of them their reelection for no meaning. And so I think there will be a lot of consternation if that happens.
If we have no more final questions, we'll now have Charles Cushman come and give the final remarks.
All right, well, thank you. First, I'd like to ask us to give a hand to our guests for their comments tonight. I'd also like to thank Mark for doing a great job keeping the flow going. Thank you very much. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening, and thanks to everyone who asked the great questions to keep us going. And I do hope that we will see you again on the 4th when we talk about what just happened. From the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University, thank you, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Good night.